Turning now to the Christakis and Fowler piece, looking at a sociocentric network in the Framingham Health Survey, and looking at the effect of network dynamics on the spread of obesity throughout the network. Here's a brief summary of their findings. They observe that the effects of an alter's weight gain on an ego's weight gain in the following ways. If a friend gains weight or becomes obese specifically, the chance that the ego becomes obese increases by 57%. Similarly, with sibling and spouse weight gain, the ego is likely to has an increased chance of becoming obese of around 37 or 40%. And what they observed is that there is no apparent effect of neighbor's weight gain on the ego's weight gain. And then drilling down more specifically on the effects of friends' weight gain on the ego's weight gain, they find that those friends are dependent on the directionality of the nomination in the relationship and on the sex of those participants. So for example, if in the case where an ego has nominated an alter, but it's one direction, it's not a reciprocated nomination, the weight increase, the risk of increasing becoming obese is 57%. However, when the nomination is reciprocated, the ego nominates the alter and the alter nominates the ego, the likelihood that the ego increases weight, becomes obese, is 170% greater. But when the ego is nominated by the alter but doesn't reciprocate that nomination, there's no apparent effect. They also find that the same-sex relationship matters. In other words, if the ego and the alter are the same sex, that matters, and it's especially pronounced among men relative to women. And so what they're testing is 3 potential explanations for the evident clustering that they observe in the Framingham study sociocentric network. And those 3 proposed explanations are, of course, homophily, shared exposures, and social induction. So homophily meaning something akin to birds of a feather flock together. You observe the clustering in the social network because the members of the social network are similar, independent of each other, but similar, and that's why they're connected in the network. They also might be observed to cluster in the social network because they share exposures by virtue of their proximity or connections to each other, and it's that environmental exposure that induces the change observed over time, or the mechanism they're primarily interested in, which is the contagion type of mechanism of social induction, that there's actually social influence operating across members of a social network. And I'll illustrate these 3 proposed explanations momentarily, but in essence what they find here, overall looking at the patterns across a social network, is that it's the social, not the geographic distance, that makes a difference, that's impactful on weight gain across the social network. So here's a diagram to illustrate the 3 proposed mechanisms. Imagine you're observing 2 individuals who wind up on a bridge together, and you're observing them from a distance, so you're not really sure what's going on, why they're there, what they're going to do. And then you observe one jump in quick succession after the other, and you're not certain about why this has occurred. So from a distance, you might conclude, if we apply those 3 mechanisms, that they were perhaps both on the bridge because independent of each other, they don't know each other. They're interested in, let's make it less grim, recreational bridge jumping. Let's pretend it's a low bridge and they're not going to get hurt, but they enjoy jumping off the bridge. And it's their independent enthusiasm for this activity that brings them both together, and they happen to be there on the same bridge at the same time because of their independent shared preferences for bridge jumping. Alternatively, if there were 2 people who, again, were independent or not of each other, but wound up on the bridge at the same time and there was a sudden gust of wind, that would represent, in contrast to the homophily explanation, simply a shared environmental exposure. They were there, independent of each other or not, but the reason for them jumping in quick succession was because they both experienced this gust of wind at slightly different intervals, and that's why they both went over the bridge. The third explanation, the social induction explanation, would be that they're on the bridge. One of them says to the other, for example, "Oh, you should try to jump. It's really fun." watch me do it, you really ought to give it a try. One goes over, the other says that looks like fun or interesting and never considered it before, but that person seems to be quite enthusiastic. I'll give it a try too. In that instance, the second person would not have jumped had it not been for the influence of the first jumper. And the basis for the conclusion of Christakis-Fowler that the mechanism operating here across a social network is social induction is largely by influence. First, they rule out the relative importance of homophily because they observe a lagged effect, that when the alter gains weight between time 1 and 2, for example, that temporal direction of that relationship, one gains weight before the other gains weight, is there in their interpretation a reason to dismiss the relative importance of homophily, because if it was homophily, these people would be very similar. That's why they're connected to the network, and they would be more likely to gain weight concurrently. There wouldn't be a lagged effect. They rule out shared exposures or the relative importance of shared exposures because they observe that the geographic proximity doesn't matter, so they're arguing that they're not really sharing the same physical or environmental features, and it's not that they have a shared exposure to Dunkin' Donuts or something, other fast food that is influencing the observed lag effect in weight gain. And they emphasize the role of social induction also because of the directionality of the nomination being so important in terms of the relative likelihood of increased weight gain. So again, when the ego does not nominate the alter, for example, there's no apparent effect. The strongest effect being when the ego and the alter's nominations are reciprocated, meaning a closer tie, a more primary tie, and it's in that situation where you're most likely to have network effects or clustering in obesity. And similarly, you have a significant effect of the nomination of the ego of the alter when the alter gains weight, and that these friend effects, of course, also we should mention, are being more pronounced than the family effect suggests this is not simply some biological shared mechanism, some genetic propensity for obesity that we're just watching play out with a slight lagged effect. One interesting feature of the entry of this paper, which made a very big impact, I would say, in the field when it came out in 2007, was the impact, the reaction in the popular media. So I'll leave these here for you to read. I would characterize the popular reactions, of which I read many at the time that this was in the New York Times. I would characterize them in three ways. One was sort of this constitutes victim blaming, and is bad for that reason, that we're blaming fat people for the weight gain of others. A second reaction was sort of the flip side of that, saying this was a lousy excuse, giving people a lousy excuse for not taking responsibility for their own weight gain because they can blame it on their friends. And the third reaction, sort of orthogonal to that, was that this is basically a big waste of taxpayer money and that the science is crap and shouldn't be supported and so forth. And I would say that by and large those comments reflected a misunderstanding of the way in which these data were uniquely gathered, because they weren't, of course, as you know, as the point of the Framingham study and the network data from it is that they weren't collected for this purpose. They were collected instrumentally to follow people over time, and were actually very creatively repurposed to create a sociocentric network of that community, instead of being collected for this purpose. But that's also, of course, a limitation of the study as well. So here is the now I can shrug my personal responsibility. Here's the wow, this science sucks. And so forth. The scientific reactions were also varied. You saw people being really excited about this and saying it was really innovative and a real exciting addition to the literature. and then some more skeptical reactions, and particularly pointing out the problem, which is a very real problem, that the uniqueness of this study limits the potential for replication, because the Framingham data are so unique, and in one particular community, the ability to replicate it and also to estimate its generalizability to other social contexts is very, very limited. There have also been a series of other studies that have tried to look at and replicate the patterns observed in Christakis and Fowler using other data. So these studies look at health data, also really good comprehensive sociocentric network data, and in the first instance try to demonstrate the fact that it's really difficult to exclude the role of environmental factors in the observed patterning of obesity across social networks. And the second one, it's a little bit more tongue-in-cheek, and what they're doing here is, excuse me, showing that these observed network relationships and these multiple degrees of separation and so forth can be observed when you look at outcomes where the role of social contagion is highly improbable: acne, headaches, and height. And so here they're showing that these same patterns can really be produced when it doesn't really meet the sort of bar in terms of plausibility. And again, much of the scientific reaction and I've put several instances of this in the supplemental material on this piece. The study raises important problems and questions about both internal validity and generalizability. Generalizability, Framingham's unique, and again, the data are really unique, so it's hard to replicate and hard to estimate the extent to which this might apply to different communities. Framingham might be homogeneous in a lot of important ways, and therefore the relative impact of environmental factors might be muted in this context, and in different contexts might be more apparent. In terms of internal validity, the main argument here is that it's really hard to rule out issues around selection and confounding due to homophily or homophily-type mechanisms, in part because there are lots of reasons why people become friends that are related to health outcomes but are not being measured and therefore potential confounders. And one example that these authors, Cohen, Cole, and Fletcher, give to highlight how that might work would be, for example, a relationship between self-esteem and obesity. Now, two friends might become friends and therefore be homophilous on, for example, low self-esteem. And that low self-esteem is going to be potentially related to weight gain in each one of them at some later point in time, but not manifest at that initial instance when they form their friendship. So they're becoming obese independently of each other, but by virtue of the same common prior cause, which in this case would be low self-esteem. And and that's just one instance of other mechanisms that might create similarities among people or selection mechanisms operating within the social network that might be related to the shared emergence, the shared experience of some other outcome that itself is not directly related in a causal way. The other question the study raises is just what are the implications? And in the Fowler interview that I posted on Colbert, you can see that he's not shy about sort of extrapolating implications, policy or practice implications from these studies, which I think are arguably a little bit questionable. I think it's slightly overstated, very overstated, and it's not really clear from the study itself what exactly we can do with these insights. And despite several challenges, again, see the supplemental material, the Christakis and Fowler model has been extended to multiple outcomes like loneliness, depression, smoking, happiness, divorce, and widely disseminated. And they've compiled these different studies using the Framingham data in this one book, Connected, about which they say everything we do or say tends to ripple through our network, having an impact on our friends, 1 degree, our friends' friends, 2 degrees, and even our friends' friends' friends, 3 degrees. And Here, many of the critics of the work highlight the extent to which the mechanism of social contagion is sort of overstated relative to the importance of things like selection or homophily and the environment, especially because it's by virtue of inference that they're emphasizing the social contagion mechanism. Now, one caveat to that critique is that, of course, social networks do matter, and that no one's really disputing that fundamental insight, nor is there a dispute of the fundamental insight that social norms, that their social influence operates across social networks in a really profound way, in ways that's been really understood for quite a long time around behaviors, drugs, alcohol, smoking, etc., that the social norm piece of the content that travels across social networks is very profoundly related to health. So I think when we look critically at this study, we need to avoid the proverbial throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because I think that the role of social influence across networks is probably beyond reproach and not to be questioned fundamentally. It's just that in this instance it might be overstated, particularly with emphasis around this contagion mechanism.